As today's story goes from our scripture reading, as you've already heard, Jesus took Peter and James and John with him. They climbed up a high mountain where he was transfigured before them. I always say I don't like these words that we only use in church and we don't really know what they mean. I wonder if they really make sense to us. So I thought it might be helpful to know that the Greek word that we translate transfigured is metamorpho, which is the same word that we get for metamorphosis in English. And that's still not like a super common word, but we might know what it means from the idea of a metamorphosis from a caterpillar to a butterfly. That's probably our most common use of that word. So it means to change form. To be transfigured is to have a metamorphosis or maybe transformation. Here in the story, the change happens to Jesus, who's bathed in dazzling light, so bright that nothing on earth could match it. And as he is transfigured into this bright glowing form, two great figures of the Hebrew scriptures appear, Moses on one side and Elijah on the other. Moses represents the law, Elijah represents the prophets. And then God speaks. And God says something we've heard God say before at the baptism of Jesus. God says, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased." Now, if you think a little bit about Moses and Elijah, you might remember that they also had mountaintop encounters with God. Moses encountered God first on Mount Sinai, where God spoke to him from a burning bush. Elijah encountered God on Mount Horeb, where he had fled. Elijah went to Mount Horeb to escape persecution. Ahab and Jezebel were pursuing Elijah to take his life. And there he heard the voice of God in the sound of sheer silence. So these great figures of the Bible meet God on the mountains, and Jesus is no exception. One thing that's different about the Jesus story, though, is that Jesus takes his disciples with him. Where Moses and Elijah encountered God by themselves, Jesus brings Peter and James and John. And they too are witness to this transfiguration that happens on the mountaintop. Peter is frightened, the text says, or all three of them are frightened. But Peter, as Rick pointed out, seems to like being on the mountain with these great figures of the tradition, being on the mountain where God speaks. And so Peter suggests that they should settle down there. "Lord, it's good for us to be here," he says. "If you want, I'll make 3 dwellings, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah." I guess Peter and James and John were going to sleep outside. I don't know. It turns out, actually, that there are lots of sacred mountains in the world. One of my favorite places on earth is a little open-air chapel in the mountains of North Carolina. Crowpatrick is a holy mountain in Ireland that sees thousands of pilgrims every year. The Incans built Machu Picchu high in the Andes Mountains. I wonder if the places that you come from have mountains or hills that are somehow connected with the divine or somehow held as special or sacred. Anybody have places like that that you know of here or somewhere else? Maybe? Okay, a few. Why do we do this? Perhaps we do it so Rick didn't have the answer. I'm not sure if I have the answer either, but I'm going to venture a couple guesses. Maybe we build our mountaintop shrines because we want to hold on to those experiences that happen on the mountaintop. Maybe we build them to try to understand the experiences. Maybe we do it because we want to control those experiences. Maybe to pass them along to another generation. Lots of possible answers to the why question. But whatever the reason, it seems that we humans are inclined to set up camp on our literal and our proverbial holy mountains. I don't think I can do anything about that.
Yeah, that's not you.
Rick, in his children's story, did a good job, I think, of reminding the children of what they know and what we already know. No one is meant to camp on the mountain forever. We aren't meant to live in our tents forever. But that's not to say that we haven't tried, both as individuals and as the institutional church. When we have close encounters with God, we want to hold on to them. When things are going just exactly the way we hope, we want to prolong that experience, right?
Right.
When we're in a place of indescribable beauty, we want to linger there. Maybe we even want to own it. When we're close to power, we want to wield that power as long as we can. Once we believe or know or understand something, we want it to stay steadfast and true forever. It's good for us to be here, we think. Let's make some structures. Let's set up camp so that God will stay with us. So what are some of the tents that we try to set up in order to preserve our mountaintop experiences, to hold on to something that is transcendent? I thought about the tent of tradition, the tent where we do things the way we have always done them. Might our traditions, even or especially our most beloved traditions, be tents that we erect to preserve some kind of revelation or experience of the past? Do we continue to serve those traditions even if they no longer serve the gospel? Or maybe we should consider the tent of respectability, the tent where people and things have to look and behave in a certain way in order to be valued and loved. I think this is the tent we enter when we look for others, especially the voice of our culture, for approval. In our spiritual lives, this might mean we don't make room for any kinds of expression of faith that might threaten or upend our lives or our relationships, that might upset our neighbors. In our institutional life, it means that there is little room for people who do not conform to social norms of respectability. But I think if we dwell too long in the tent of respectability, we'll find that Jesus doesn't dwell there with us. I also thought about the tent of productivity, or the tent of success, achievement. The tent that measures your value by how much you produce or accomplish. Sometimes in the church, we think we can measure our faithfulness by how many worshipers are in the pews, or how much money goes into the offering plate. Certainly there are preachers who will promise you financial success and personal glory if you will pray a certain kind of prayer or give money to a certain cause, usually theirs. We think that if we can only achieve enough, then we could be secure on the mountaintop. Then we could be sure that God is still with us. You might be able to think of other ways that we try to hold on to God, or to box God in, or to make God fit our plans and expectations. You might have your own favorite tents that you want to pitch on the mountaintop so that you can stay there forever. But you know, and I know, that tents were not made to live in forever. When we think back to Moses and Elijah, we know that Moses didn't stay on the mountain. When he encountered God in that transfigured bush, he took off his shoes for a holy moment. But then he grabbed his staff and walked down the mountain, back to Egypt, where his people were still enslaved. He went back to set them free. The mountain experience called him back to the struggles of his people. And Elijah didn't stay on the mountain either, even though his life was being sought by Ahaz and Jezebel. After the voice of God whispered to him from the stillness, it sent him right back to his dangerous prophetic life. and nor were Jesus and the disciples meant to stay on the mountain. Just a week earlier, Jesus had explained to his disciples that he had to be willing to risk his life in order to defeat the powers of death in the world. And he told them that they too must take up their cross and follow him, to lose their lives in order to save them. Moses, Elijah, and Jesus did not stay on the mountaintop. And when Peter announced his intent to build 3 tents, God interrupted him. While he was still speaking, God interrupted him. Disciples, that's us, disciples cannot settle on the mountain of transcendence, the mountain of beauty, the mountain of power, even the mountain of knowledge. We do experience Jesus there, and they are glorious experiences. But if we want to truly understand Jesus, then we have to follow him off the mountain and into the valleys, the places in the world where the forces of death are raging. Now, I do want to go back to that analogy of tents. Tents are actually an important idea in both ancient and modern Judaism. In Leviticus, God instructs the Israelites to keep a festival of booths. It's actually the same word that Peter uses when he says he wants to build a dwelling on the mountaintop, a booth or a tent. The festival is still observed in Judaism. It's called Sukkot, or the Festival of Booths. It's a harvest festival. It's celebrated in the early fall after all of the fruit trees have been harvested. And the people in Leviticus are instructed to build booths, tents. They still do this. They look kind of like lean-tos, sort of little ramshackle temporary type buildings. And they live in them for 7 days of eating and rejoicing. Their friends and family gather. They move from one neighbor's booth to the next and celebrate the harvest. We have harvest festivals in our tradition. Other traditions have harvest festivals. Why do the Israelites need booths to go with their harvest festival? Why do they need tents? Leviticus says they are to build the booths so that every generation might remember that God made the people of Israel live in tents when God brought them out of the land of Egypt. So at the peak of the harvest celebration, probably the best time of the year in an agricultural society, at the peak of the harvest celebration, the booths remind the Jewish people how God protected them and provided for them when they were living in the valleys of the wilderness. We are not meant to erect permanent structures on the mountains of revelation or beauty or power or knowledge. But we are meant to keep a tent at the ready so that we can go where God sends us. And we can remember that God protects us and provides for us as we live and work and struggle and pray in the valleys of our lives, or even on the hills like Golgotha. Since today is the last Sunday before Lent, the wilderness image is apropos. During Lent, we remember Jesus' 40 days of wandering in the wilderness, and we prepare for his 3 days in the tomb. We might ask, as we begin our Lenten journey this week, how are we being called to journey into the wild and wilderness places with God? How are we being called to struggle against the forces of death that threaten our neighbors and the earth? Could we step out of the mountaintop tent of tradition and risk doing something new, even if we're not sure of the outcome or just afraid of change in general? Could we step out of the mountaintop tent of respectability and cast our lot with the people that society has deemed suspect, the incarcerated, the undocumented, the homeless, the addicted, the mentally ill? we even step out of the mountaintop tent of productivity and achievement and trust instead that God will provide for us and protect us, even when we do not know what lies ahead or how we will make our way. And if we do that, if we leave our mountaintop tents behind, if we sacrifice what is familiar and respectable and profitable, if we take up our crosses and follow Jesus, could we even find that we have a transfiguration, a metamorphosis, a transformation of our own? Might we find that we are no longer conformed to this world, but transformed by the renewing of our mind, able to discern the good and perfect will of God? It's Romans 12. Might we find that if we take up our cross and follow, that we are seeing the glory of the Lord not only through the Mount of Transfiguration, but also on the hill of Golgotha? Might we be transformed into the same image from one degree of glory into another? That's 2 Corinthians 3. Metamorphosis. We have been blessed. We have been blessed as individuals. We've been blessed as a congregation. We've been blessed as the Church Universal to have dwelled on the mountain, to have seen the glory of God, to have heard the voice of the Lord. But the mountaintop cannot be always and forever our home. We must not only listen to Jesus, but follow him into the places of suffering and of struggle. And we can go knowing that the tent in which we dwell are not the tents that we have erected to preserve and protect and control God. It is the tent of God's faithful provision and steadfast love. It's a tent that's easy to pack up and carry with you. May it be so for you this Lent. Amen.
Amen.